Christian nationalism. This has been a hot topic in politics, particularly when it comes to the conservative side, evangelicals, the mixture of faith and politics, and a lot of the claims that have been made have been very interesting surrounding Christian nationalism. We're welcoming to the show today Kevin Singer, co-director of Neighborly Faith, who's going to reveal some data that might shock you about Christian nationalism. With no further ado, here is Kevin Singer. So Kevin, you have a new study out, a fascinating study, a look at Christian nationalism. And before we get into the study, you are the co-director of Neighborly Faith. Tell us a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, thanks so much, Billy, for having me. It's always a joy to be with you. So Neighborly Faith, we are in the business of working with college students to think about what it means to live in a society of many faiths and worldviews. And, most Christians are doing that anyway. The question, of course, is how are we doing that? Our hope is that we can equip the next generation of Christian leaders to be able to have a winsome approach to their interactions with Muslims and others. And the hope is not that we would dumb down the gospel and how offensive it is in a culture that, your truth is your truth and my truth. Our hope is simply that in how we are presenting ourselves and the truth of Christianity, we are doing so in a way that's effective. We're doing so in a way that people of other faiths resonate with. And I imagine Christians out there are probably in full support of, how do we show up in culture in a way that doesn't polarize people from wanting to get to know us, but actually invites them to get to know us and hear the saving message of Christ. I think that's what we hope for. That's what we go for. That's what we equip students to do.
No, and that's an incredibly important work because as culture shifts and changes, the tone, the message doesn't change, the truth doesn't change, but the tone and how you deliver it, if you want to be effective, that will need to change. And, that's what we're dealing with now. I think a lot of people have woken up and they're like, what is going on? They don't understand how we got here. And they're trying to figure out how do you engage in an effective way. So that's important work. And one of the things you've done now is this study on Christian nationalism. And this is a term that we have heard almost endlessly in the media over the past couple of years, especially the last year. I'm just going to throw it to you because I think a lot of people are confused and they don't really want to admit that they're confused. What does it mean to be a Christian nationalist? What is that?
Terrific question, Billy. And I would not come to you on this interview and say, like, we've got the objective for all times and places definition of Christian nationalism. And any time you do research, there is a sense in which you have to hearken back to what others have done. Now, we're pretty straightforward that we think the way others have studied this in the past is problematic. In fact, the original scale that was used to identify the threats and how common Christian nationalism is very small. It's only 5 questions, and it wasn't even originally designed to measure this phenomenon. It was originally designed to just think about political participation and how that relates to someone's religiosity. Now, what we've done is we've said, okay, let's take this way that others have looked at it and let's expand it and let's really focus in on, again, what does it really mean to be a Christian nationalist? Now, what we found is what a lot of researchers out there will say is they'll say, well, if you're a Christian, you're politically motivated, then you are nationalistic in some sense. We find that to be really unfair. What we find through our study is nationalism you really hit that definition when you're doing politics at the exclusion of people that frankly you're not supposed to hate. Right? That's when I feel like things are rising to a level where something about my American identity makes me feel like I can no longer be one of us anymore. It's just one of one. And to the degree we're willing to be violent in that regard, that's when I feel like we have started to put country over our deepest convictions as Christians. So I say all that to say this, and I'll read this straight from our report. So we would say it's a movement advancing a vision of America's past, present, and future that excludes. And I'm going to stop there before I move on because I think that hopefully resonates with what I just said. There's something about this worldview that says Jews, no, blacks, no, right? Like there's only one ideal person who has very certain demographics and qualities and characteristics. They count. Other people do not count. So that's, I would say, sort of what we would call like the Thanksgiving turkey of this ideology. And then we would say there's usually comes with that kind of a romanticizing of Christianity and America's marriage throughout history. Now, I would definitely say Christianity was very much embedded in our nation's history and development, but I do think there's a point where we can't imagine America existing without Christianity and vice versa. And I just don't know if that's the fairest reading of history. And so again, to sort of put it together, there's the exclusionary nature of the ideology. It's just me, just us. No one else counts as a citizen. No one else counts as a person. No one else counts. And then there's that idea of we can only render America's history in a way that really favors Christianity's influence without maybe thinking about the way diverse peoples, ethnicities, cultures have come into America and shaped its current. Now, people might say, okay, well, that's one definition. I am totally fine saying that that's a limitation of any study on this topic. Is you're going to have to at some point put a flag in the sand and say, this is what I think the ideology is, and this is how I think it's operating in society. And I want to put an asterisk on that and say, if you're just a Christian out there who's convicted about the gospel of Jesus Christ and wants to be engaged in the public square and has policy preferences, that does not make you a Christian nationalist by any stretch of the imagination. If that's true, then me and everyone I know is a Christian
Is a
nationalist.
Christian nationalist. But
Right,
see,
right. And that's where people are frustrated, right? Because it's like, why does it seem like everyone now is, unless you're on the left, right?
well, that is, you gave a definition, right?
Right.
And that is the label. That definition is sort of the label. And that anybody who's a Christian, as you said, who cares about politics, which there are a lot of Christians in this country, they get clumped in with this now. And that media narrative, it makes it feel like everybody is a Christian nationalist. This problem is the biggest problem facing America right now. You dove into the research.
Right.
What did you find when
Yeah.
you started going out and asking?
So the biggest thing, the first thing you find is no, not 51% of Americans are Christian nationalists, as is cited in the most popular study in this area. No, Black Americans are not the most likely, sorry, to be Christian nationalists, as is cited in the most popular study, which is just unbelievable that anyone would take seriously this topic and find that our neighbors who are Black or African American are most likely to be Christian nationalists or have an ideology that's potentially violent. That to me I find very troubling. The other thing we found is those who by the way, we used an expanded scale, which, not to get too nerdy, we started asking the right questions, and not just questions where we could cherry pick the data and say, oh, you want scripture read in schools? You must be a Christian nationalist. Because we all know that's not fair, because even Muslims and Jews want scripture read in schools. Even Muslims and Jews want prayer done in schools. So to the degree that we're calling a Muslim a Christian nationalist is absurd, right? And so we're actually finding ourselves looking at these questions that other scholars have asked and scratching our heads and saying, well, of course everybody's a Christian nationalist according to these questions. Gosh, most of our country are still people of faith, and most of the way that most have looked at this is there's just not enough to pull them apart. People of faith and people who care about politics. So another key finding we found is that those who we actually go on to classify as having that label exhibit very neighborly behaviors. In fact, I think it was like 60% of those who we give that label to support all faiths having their symbols represented in public spaces and government buildings. I read one thought leader who said that Christian nationalism was the single biggest threat to religious freedom in the United States. But then you find that 52% of those we classify as Christian nationalists are willing to have an interfaith conversation or cooperate with people across faiths to work on disaster relief or to feed the hungry or serve the poor. The simple fact is, most of the narrative on this topic has been informed by very, 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 I would call politically motivated looks at a very small set of data. And what we've done
Yeah.
is we've expanded the pool of data to actually ask, like, who are these people? What do they really want and believe? And it turns out most of those who you might call the boogeyman in the Christian nationalism closet are probably those most likely to show up when you need help.
See, that is remarkable. And I want to read something here that you had sent over to me when we were talking about doing this interview. And let me just read it. It says, those we categorize as Christian nationalist adherents are no more likely to self-report unfavorable attitudes towards Jews, Hispanics, and Middle Easterners than the average American. Compared to others, they are slightly more favorable of Jews and Black Americans.
Yeah.
That is a complete reversal of what has sort of been perpetuated about quote unquote Christian nationalists. What was your reaction as you were looking at that data, as you were analyzing it?
Well, for one, I thought, I wasn't actually that surprised because, and we've talked about this, Billy. There's if we can convince people that anyone who is a convicted Christian who wants to be involved in politics is a terrible, horrible racist who wants nothing for minorities than them getting kicked out of the country or not being allowed to participate in the electoral process, et cetera, then they can easily be dismissed and their rights can be undermined, right? We can begin taking away privileges because the idea is if we can make the argument that the more this group is allowed to show up and be represented, the more people are going to suffer, then yeah, we can easily say, oh, you seem to have this perspective. Okay, let's keep you under wraps. Let's keep you in a position where you cannot exercise speech, where you cannot exercise freedom of religion and association and all those other really important freedoms. The truth is with every Christian nationalist, according to our study, is most likely a Christian, right? And I think that's what people forget is if most Christian nationalists are Christians, then yes, you are eventually going to run into someone who believes that all people are made in the image of God, who believes that all people have inherent dignity and rights, who believe that from womb to tomb, these are people who deserve our love, God's love, and God's hospitality and truth. And I think that, and what we found in our study is those who are classified as Christian nationalists are all those also the most likely to be religious, to attend religious services, to pray daily, to fast, to be in worship services every week. And again, if we trust our churches to be speaking the truth of God's word, then these are people who at worst are trying to just understand what is the relationship between my faith and my politics, what's my responsibility to my society, and they're asking those questions mostly in good faith. Very few are like, oh, the only way I understand this is violence. That is
Well,
by
that
far the exception.
that was going to be my question to you. You know, that initial definition that we went through on Christian nationalism, you know, the exclusion, take the extreme, right? The
Yeah,
definition and the media narrative. When we talk about, okay, that one study that says 51% are Christian nationalists,
right.
do we have any idea of what percentage of Americans actually have that extreme sort of, they would fit that bill of what the media is saying these people are?
Very, very few. In fact, so we took the original scale of 5 questions and expanded it to 14 because we're like, okay, we're not going to ask two more. We're going to ask a lot more. And then we're going to drill down under each of these questions. And some of our questions were more on the offense, right? It was my political opponents are animals. You know, they don't deserve to live. We should be kicking them out of the country, et cetera, et cetera. And the truth is, most of those we classify as Christian nationalists don't answer even most of those questions in the affirmative. The majority of those we classify as Christian nationalists answer less than half of those 14 statements in the affirmative, and even fewer consistently answer the most harmful questions or statements in the affirmative. You can look at our study and absolutely say if every January 6th protester was an evangelical Republican, right, which is because our study found that very few are actually Republican of this group.
Only 17%.
17%, right? So even the narrative that these are all, lockstep Republicans is just completely informed by either bad data or no data at all. Um, but anyway, it is extremely unlikely looking at our data that the group that stormed the Capitol that day is you and everyone sitting in your row at church on Sunday. That is not probably who stormed that Capitol. And the truth of the matter is, we haven't surveyed everyone who stormed that Capitol, but it's extremely unlikely that if we were to get to know every single person who was there that day, that they would fit that convenient media narrative that is clearly slanted against convicted Christians and those who are conservative.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting looking at all of this, right? Because it is hard for me, as I'm a data person, much like you. I'm a communications person. I look at history, and I don't want a theocracy. I'm not a Christian nationalist, right? But I look at, look, it's hard to pull up data and look at societies move away from God. And I'm talking about the cultural move away from God, even removing prayer from schools. We can have the debate about whether it should have been there. Everything has gotten worse in schools and society since we've done these things. And there's no arguing that it's
Right.
been good. It has not been good. Am I saying we need to enforce those things right now? No, I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is the reality is there has been an effect in this country of moving away from faith. And when people argue, I mean, look, we had a Supreme Court case over a year ago with a guy who was voluntarily praying on the 50-yard line after a football game, and it became an international incident when really, I mean, we're having these arguments that they feel so silly, but there's a real danger here, though. And I don't want to, and this could happen on either side, but of diminishing people, of putting them into a box, of saying, as you were saying before, all these people are dangerous who feel this way, and they
Mhm.
shouldn't be included in the political process. You know, how can this study, in your view, in light of what I just said,
Yep.
help people better understand, better navigate these flammable issues, especially in an election year?
Completely. Such a good question. The first thing that came up for me that I wanted to share is if you look at our data, you'll find that it's not just the so-called Christian nationalist that maybe has some enhanced uh, concern about their political opponents. We have an entire other group in our study called zealous separationists, who are those who are very strongly opposed to the marriage of church and state, who are equally as prone to violence against their political opponents. So it's really unfair to say that there's this particularly Christian and conservative group. Watch out for the flags. We've those classic shots we see on the media. What you're not going to see is the hordes of those who are anti-faith, who are just as frankly to be feared. If we're going to use that same logic, then there are those who are again mobilizing against faith being a part of our nation's fabric, who also need or deserve as much media coverage and alarmism as we are seeing about Christian nationalists. So that's the first thing for sure that needs to come out. And we've received some really good critique from conservatives on our study saying that we didn't emphasize that enough. And so I want to make that very clear. Like, we are not out here with our data to say that Christian nationalists are the big bad wolf. What we're saying is, to the degree to which anyone is dogmatically against the existence of a human being in the public square, even as a potential recipient of God's grace and love, we're like, hey, we got to step back from that. And there is a whole group on, we would say, the left, who are less religious, less Christian, who would definitely seek for those of a Christian political persuasion to not have a voice in the public square. There's no doubt about that. Now, here's what our study, I think, says. I think what our study says is there are Christians, like even you and me, Billy, or others who are in the pews, who are really prone to not recognizing the sovereignty of the good hand and plan of God in 2024. And instead of saying, God appoints rulers. God, he asks us to steward his society and his world, and we're trying to do that the best we can. But I think what we can sometimes fall prey to is a spirit of fear that drives us to pick up the sword in the Garden of Gethsemane and cut people, right?
Yeah.
And I think what our study says is we are all prone to the kind of ideology that says more about our desire for power potentially in the political sphere than our desire to be martyrs of Christ in the public sphere. And I think if this study can help us locate our passion more in how can we be self-sacrificial, not of our children and the things they're hearing in schools, for example, but how can we show up in ways that are, we would say, neighborly. That's why we exist, in ways that are full of conviction but full of compassion and grace. But we're not going to give up an inch of ground, but we're definitely not going to let anyone label us as, domestic terrorists because we have an opinion on, you know, LGBT or trans issues or abortion. We are enacting on our dogma just the way that secularists are acting on theirs. Now, the question is not, are we the only dogmatics, right, in the country because we are really passionate about, the sanctity of life or something. The question is simply, where is our dogma? Where's our dogma going to go? And how is it going to reveal what we're really about? And I hope that if the study does anything, it's let us show up as Christians who are politically motivated in all of the ways that demonstrates that our faith is secure.
Yeah.
And we do not need to be afraid. I think if we can do that, then we're on the right track. Now, I'll say this too. What you'll find in our study too is different viewpoints. You won't come to our study and walk away saying, wow, these guys are clearly on one side. We asked Andrew T. Walker from Southern Seminary to write an essay. We asked Caitlin Scheiss, who wrote the Bible, and I forget exactly what the title is, and she's such a great person. The Bible and the Pulpit, I think, or the Bible and the Ballot. She's in our study. There's others who, again, do not take on our preferred necessarily political orientation. And then what we're trying to show readers is you can have an intelligent conversation, and you can walk in and saying, I think this is all bullcrap, but you could walk away having more appreciation for how people fall on different sides of this debate, and potentially walk away having a different idea of how you can show up in the political sphere with your faith.
Yeah. I mean, as I hear you talk, there are really three different things here that come to mind. And the first is that we should be able to engage and talk with people with whom we disagree, not because we're trying to have our perspective be changed. We're trying to understand. I want to know, why do I believe what I believe? And
Yes,
when I hear other people who are wrong, it actually helps solidify what I believe, why I believe it. And it
complete.
helps me, just like we were talking before, how do I interact with them? I need to understand what they believe in order for me to interact with them. And if my main goal is for them to hear the gospel, right, not to come over to a political side, then I need to be able to engage. I think the second thing that you brought up, that word fear, is so important because we are living in such a fearful society. And as Christians, we should not be getting trapped in political fear. What's going to
Totally.
happen if so and so wins? That is actually not following the gospel, to be living in fear. And we should not be doing that. And I think the third thing, which is the most important to me, putting politics before our faith, putting anything before our faith, is completely unhealthy. And a lot of us, I've been guilty of it in the past. This is a way that we have behaved and lived, and some of us are doing this now. And we should feel heavily convicted by that, to be putting the gospel first. So I'm going to
Yeah.
get off my soapbox there, but
No,
those
I
three
appreciate it. I love that.
things,
Well, that's great.
they line up perfectly with what you're saying here. And so at the end of the day, this is a very, very small group of people that the media have made to look like a very big group of people.
No doubt. Our study absolutely shows that. You will not walk away from our study thinking, wow, they could be anywhere. Like they could be sitting next to me in this restaurant right now. You will walk away saying, this is a group of people, frankly, that can be reached. This is a group of people that somewhere along the line, they were susceptible to probably a very charismatic person or charismatic leadership who felt like they could be more prone to carrying out a violent charge. And the truth of the matter is, we don't have to be passive either. Um, we don't have to allow people to reduce us to political narratives. It's very expedient. This Christian nationalist narrative right now is politically expedient because you can use it to discount really important and healthy and beneficial ideas and policies from the public square. And we should not allow that to happen. We should let our voices be heard. We should be not lights under a basket, but on a hill. But let's do it in a way that people see the Christian in us and not the nationalist in us. And I think we can do that super well. Let's vote with our ballots and with our feet. Let's show up. Let's show the love and the grace and the compassion of Christ. But let's be political. Let's be political. Christians did
Yeah.
not shrink back from that in the Bible. They were engaged in the happenings of the public, and we should do the same thing.
I love that. Well, where can people go if they want to grab, and we can throw links in, of course, but if they want to grab the study, read it, where can they go to do that?
Go to neighborlyfaith.org. It's in look for our research tab. You'll find, so we released a study last year on young evangelicals in politics. We found that young evangelicals are some of our best citizens in America, and they are super politically engaged and they are voting with their faith. And then this year, our study is on Christian nationalism. You can view both of those for free on our site. There's a web friendly version you can share with your friends, so you don't even have to hit download on a PDF. We want this to be shared. Please share within your churches and networks. And let's continue to hold some of these institutions accountable for the ways that they are trying to undermine well intentioned Christian faith in our country.
Well, Kevin, appreciate your time. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Billy. It's always great, and thanks for the platform that you provide for good research like ours, and really appreciate getting to know you more.
That's all for this week's Higher Ground. Make sure you head on over to highergroundtimes.com for faith and culture content and washingtontimes.com for all the news you need to read. We will see you again here on Higher Ground next week.